We're joined now by political economist Dr. McKinley. He speaks to us about the latest developments. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for speaking to us, Dr. McKinley.
Good evening.
It's been predicted for a while now that the Russia-Ukraine war will have an impact on energy security and geopolitics. We're seeing that now with our reports from our colleagues there. And that's because Russia has a relationship with more than 24, I believe, of European countries or European nations. So if it's a chess game, what would be the next step then if indeed what Joe Biden says it's true that they're going for the jugular in terms of the Russian economy?
Well, I think we have to separate the United States from Europe. So the United States is a different story. Biden has announced that the U.S. is banning all imports to the United States. And that doesn't really hurt the U.S. a huge amount because only 5% of their oil imports come from Russia. Whereas in the European Union, it's 40% of all energy needs, mostly gas and oil as well. So Biden has announced this, but the EU has not come on board. In fact, Biden said very specifically, our allies might not be able to join us, some of them. Britain has said they're going to phase it out by the end of the year. EU has not made any move in that regard. So then Russia counters and threatens to cut off Nord Stream 1. So in that sense, it's Europe and Russia, I think, are just positioning themselves. The United States can do this, but Europe is a different story. And Russia would have to consider, and Putin, obviously, in particular, would have to consider the economic consequences for Russia of cutting that supply. So right now, it's like maneuvering with nobody, at least in the EU and Russia, on the gas and energy front. Nobody wants to cross that line. The United States can cross it because the consequences are not nearly as great.
Well, as you say, that there's a quid pro quo of which the U.S. is wittingly in the U.S., and that's why we're talking about the changing relations of energy security and geopolitics. As you mentioned, the Russian Deputy Prime Minister said they're looking at halting natural gas shipments to Europe, and this is something that would endanger Europe holistically, just as we mentioned what the ban from the US says. So what options are available? The UK says it's weaning itself off until the end of the year. But for Europe, countries like Germany who have been outspoken about being against the ban from the get-go.
Yeah, well, listen, I mean, it would certainly take quite a bit of time for Europe to find alternative sources and to replace that. So if there was a cutoff, there would be serious short-term pain for consumers mostly, obviously, because the price would go up. But I mean, generally for security purpose. But the same would apply to Russia. The pain for Russia would be immense in terms of its reliance on that stream of income to fuel the wars. In Ukraine and other places, I think is going to be quite substantial. So in that sense, the alternatives, there's Venezuela, OPEC, pressure is going to have to be put, and is already being put on other oil producing countries to open the taps so not to constrain supply. The United States shale gas production will go through the roof again as it was about 10 or 15 years ago. So you'll eventually get that fossil fuel replacement, but not in the short run.
And let's look at timelines. So the timelines that Europe is speaking about now in terms of being Russian energy free is 2030. So that's clearly very far off. And it's been said that oil is easier to replace than natural gas, that Europe imports liquefied natural gas, and a lot of that dependence is from Russia. So what would be, in the meantime, American LNG exports?
Well, that would be partially would be American, partially would be summer is coming, so it's the timing in some senses. Europe is good in the sense that the energy prices and the energy consumption would be much lower than it would be a few months ago. They'll look to also new gas supply. I mean, look, this is we right in our own neighborhood. There's gas exploration, the Mozambican gas short. There's going to be massive exploration, but basically there's a whole range of sources, but those are going to come online later. So for Europe, basically you'd have to take a hit. They'd have to constrain supply, up the prices, and look at a 6 to 8 month, a year-long strategy of replacing that 40% gradually. And they would be able to do it But the question is, what would be the economic and political cost for the governments? And I think that's the key question that they're asking themselves at the moment.
And there's been a suggestion by some that just even in the tussle for replacing Russian gas or oil, that some countries in Asia might be left out, as has been evidenced by the fact that at some point when Russia or the US, when they were shipping, I think it was in January, to Europe, some of the ships were heading for Asia, but it turned out because European buyers were offering to pay more that they did a turnaround.
Yeah, listen, I mean, when you can see what's happened with supply lines with COVID. And then what we get in this case with politics and war and boycotts, we get even more supply chain problems. And certain sectors, as you mentioned, Asia, our continent, we're going to suffer from those kinds of things. But in some ways, one can look at this, if you would have that angle to look at it and say, we've been talking for a long time about alternative sources of energy, about moving away from fossil fuels, about this. This could be the shock that moves in that direction. Shocks obviously have short-term consequences. And so we're not going to be able to avoid, none of us. We're going to see massive price rises in fuel. We're going to see a whole range of price rises in food and knock-on effects. It's not just Europe. It's going to be the whole world in different ways. So this gas and oil issue is just a metaphor in some ways of a larger supply crisis that's happening across the world as a result, not just of the war, but on top of 2 years of COVID. We've got serious issues here. But in some ways, it could be seen that there's a little bit of a silver lining in the long term if obviously this war doesn't get out of control.
So it's been said that it creates opportunities for some. Australia has been pointed out. We mentioned Venezuela, Iran, which have been dubbed rogue countries, undesirable. But if they could, the deals will be made. What about Africa? Does it have the coastal import facilities to be able to position itself?
Well, those are the kinds of things, when opportunities come along, you've got to make plans and you've got to make investment in infrastructure and supply chains and all sorts of things. So that's why I say it's an opportunity in that sense. I mean, we can see with the commodities from our own country that there could probably be another 20 to 30% exports if the infrastructural issues and the constraints at the ports weren't so great. So in that sense, it's an incentive. It's an incentive for Africa. Right now, there are not that many ports in the African continent would be able to ramp up massively over a short period of time. But it's very possible. And I think these are the kinds of things that let's put the money where our mouths are in the sense of talking about these opportunities that now exist for Africa also to take a much sort of more central place in the global sort of supply chain of commodities that are at the moment quite in demand. So I think in that sense, it's possible, but it's going to be difficult. And again, once again, as we've seen, it's all about political will to do this and to make the correct decisions. And that's where our continent and many others have been very weak.
But the observation has also been made that on the road to a just transition, a lot of expectations are on African countries, and yet the cost is higher for us, even though the impact is greater for Africa. So in terms of policy propositions, our agriculture sector, can it be positioned in a way that, it takes advantages of that diversified oil supplies? Again, can we be looking to the crops that we are already producing to produce energy?
Well, I mean, biofuels and those things have been around for quite some time. But I think that where it seems to me at least, and I'm not an environmental expert in terms of alternative sources of energy, but it seems to me that the most rational and most cost-effective means of what we have in the shorter term are natural sources of that. And crops what we need to do is we need to grow crops to feed our populations. This is what our continent needs to do first and foremost. Before we start thinking about producing it for fuel, we have got other sources of energy that we need to really utilize. And I think that's where, again, I was saying the political will to have a long-term perspective as opposed to some short-term gain.
So where should we be looking at the moment if we are going to operate with some expediency? What should be our go-to plan at the moment?
Well, we've already got it on paper in some ways. It's just a question of ramping it up. I mean, solar, obviously solar energy, wind energy, the degree to which we can cut back on, make much more efficient energy sources in terms of our domestic, as well as the wastage that happens. We have huge amounts of wastage. So it's about also, if we begin to invest in that infrastructure, and we can do so fairly quickly in terms of taking care, we can cut back. And I think, the gap can be filled. What is coming in terms of this gap that is coming in South Africa, we're not going to get hit as hard as some others. And I think we could make and fill that gap both on the energy front, but also on the expenditure front for creating possibilities for economic growth, for job creation, for a range of different kinds of things. So if we have this all on paper in particular ways, but it's a question of the political will to invest in it. And then for the government to actually follow on its own decisions with regards to the National Development Plan, but also with regards to the necessary redistribution. Because here's an opportunity for us to begin to address our systemic problems instead of seeing it as a stopgap measure just to deal with the crisis at hand.
Thank you for your time and your insights, Dr. Dale McKinley, political economist, on the latest developments on the Russia-Ukraine war, with the United States announcing its ban on Russian energy.